Delta Airlines was sued by a group of women. I think they've been around for a while, they were just in the closet. A lot of airlines use the stewardess as sexy flight attendants. A lot of those flight attendants from the 60s are still flying today. Yes, people.
Come and fly away with me. Don't you be afraid, everything will change. You and I, jumping off the edge. They said dreamers never die.
Have you ever wondered how the flight attendant profession got started? Well, I'm gonna tell you. Let's get into it. Before there were flight attendants, before there were stewardesses, before there were stewards, there were cabin attendants. They were men. Yes, the first flight attendant was a man. About 95 years ago, men were hired to help out the pilots doing the things such as changing the tires, checking the oil, actually even filling the airplane with jet fuel. They were called cabin attendants because they actually sat in the cabin. They did not know how to fly the aircraft. They were there mainly for service and attending the pilots, serving them their crew meals. And if they were lucky, they would help sometimes navigate the aircraft. A few years later, airlines started flying to Hawaii from the West Coast, San Francisco and Los Angeles, and they needed people to help carry with the cargo and help people get on and off the aircrafts. That was the birth of the stewards. Most of the stewards came from Honolulu, Hawaii. There was about a group of 15 original stewards who were the face of the airlines, but mostly at that time they were just flying cargo and the US mail. As the airplane started getting a little bit bigger and started using it as more of a passenger airliner, they needed someone to attend the passengers. So back then the aircraft weren't pressurized and people were getting sick on the aircraft, so they needed someone on there to help with air sickness and hypoxia. So a young woman named Ellen Church walked into the Boeing Air Transportation in San Francisco, and she demanded that you needed nurses on these airplanes to help out these sick passengers. And the birth of Stewardess had just began. A little known airlines named United Airlines wanted in on this, so they called Ellen Church and asked if she can get 8 of her girlfriend nurses to come on board. In 1930, United Airlines hired the first original stewardess. There were 8 of them. Although they were stewardesses, their main job was being a nurse, taking care of the passengers, and on their downtime, they would actually even help the pilots fill the aircraft, check the tires, and do the job of the engineers. Back then, these girls would work 100 hours a month and get paid $125 a month. And a little per diem that was taxed. As it became more airlines and airplanes were getting larger, the airlines needed more stewardesses, so they would go out to the Midwest and get some of these young ladies who were in the Midwest and the farm and never had left their hometown to become stewardess. It was the glamorous job at the time. During those days, women only had a few choices of professions. You could be a secretary, you could be a teacher, you can get married, or you could become a stewardess and see the world. That was the lure of being a stewardess. You could see the world. By the late 40s and early 50s, more work was required by the stewardess, and they needed more flight attendants on each flight. More work was required by the stewardess around the late 40s into the 50s. And by the 50s, airplanes were jet planes and pressurized, and the birth of jet aviation had began. Airlines were hiring stewardess like crazy all over America. And with the bigger planes became more routing, longer routes, and stewardesses had a lot of downtime. And the airline was like, what can we do to keep them busy? The airlines thought, well, we can use them in our marketing. We can use them in our commercials. We can use them as competition. Come fly the friendly skies of United. Come fly Pan Am. Come fly TWA. It was a successful campaign. A lot of airlines used the stewardess as sexy flight attendants. Or the more conservative airlines were using them as wholesome Midwestern girls. Come fly. Coffee, tea, or me? Remember that? By the time the airline of PSA, you guys remember PSA? They made the airline stewardess to be a hip, more of a fun kind of a job. The go-go boots, the colors, uniforms became the image. Every woman wanted to be a stewardess at that time. They were the cream of professions. By the early 60s into the 70s, the government was getting involved in the airlines and regulating some of the rules of the fare, who they hire, and the routings. Delta Airlines was sued by a group of women because they weren't hiring women of color, especially black women. Think about those times in the early 60s when we still had segregation, when black people still had to go in the back of the hotel to enter the hotel room. Even before the assassination of Martin Luther King and John F. Kennedy, can you imagine that stewardess who had to room up with another flight attendant who was not her race, color, sexuality, or gender. Yes, in those days, the women shared rooms, sometimes 4 to a room. Can you imagine that today? I can't. The women were successful with the lawsuit, and we saw more and more women of color become stewardesses. Now, in the early 70s, the airline started hiring men. Yay! It was just a matter of time that the lawsuit would come that they weren't hiring men as stewardesses. Men who mostly applied back then were mostly straight men. I would say 90% were straight men back then. They were applying for the job because it was an opportunity to get hitched with a stewardess, perhaps, maybe. I don't know. But for whatever reason, they were mostly straight men back then. One of the biggest perks of being a steward back then was they got their own room, and the women did not like that, which formed the birth of the union. Started getting work rules. They were hiring a lot of men, and the men were getting their own room, and the women still were sharing their rooms. So a group of women got together and formed the first union. They wanted more pay, they wanted better layovers, they wanted duty times, they wanted a larger per diem, and they wanted their own room. They also wanted to be taken serious in their profession, and they wanted a new name, and they came up with the name flight attendant, and now we have the birth of the era of flight attendants. By the time the 80s rolled around, people looked at flight attendants as more of a professional job than a glamorous job. Flight attendants decided to make this job a career, and so in part of their union negotiations, they were able to negotiate health care, flexibilities, uniform standards. And a lot of those flight attendants from the 60s are still flying today. Yes, people, they are still flying with 60 years seniority in their 80s. Let's talk about that. Also in the 80s, we saw the birth of more male gay flight attendants. They came from nowhere. Out of nowhere, they were hiring flight attendants that were gay. I think they've been around for a while. They were just in the closet. How you doing? Okay. Also in the 80s, the airlines were having great times and bad times in the 80s. Starting off in the 80s, the government had deregulated the airlines, and they can do whatever they wanted to, charge whatever price, go whatever route, fly to any city. And they did. Those airlines were buying up airplanes, routings, airports, and the airlines were getting larger and larger and larger. The airlines were hiring flight attendants by the thousands. There were wide-body aircrafts. You could have some of the aircrafts that have 20 flight attendants on one flight. The birth of the 747 was introduced. It was happy times. By the late 80s, the tax and spend era had begun. Gas prices had went up, there was a lot of hijackings, and the airlines started losing money fast and rapidly. Most airlines didn't have cash in the bank because they were buying planes and growing their airlines, and the airline industry came to a standstill. Pan Am was one of the largest airlines back then and was one of the first airlines to file for bankruptcy. They needed cash and they needed it quick. They started selling off some of their lucrative routing to the Pacific and South America, and airlines were quick to grab anything that was falling off of Pan Am to make their airlines larger. They were selling their airplanes on pennies on the dollar, they were selling their routings, their airports, their destinations. A lot of more airlines were filing for bankruptcy, they were merging with other airlines, and only the strong survived. By the mid-90s, the airlines started bouncing back and they were hiring again, they were doing new destination, gas was cheap, prices were so cheap that anybody and everybody was flying in those days. Airlines were down to 3 legacy airlines, Delta, United, and American. And smaller airlines, no-frills airlines started popping out of nowhere. We had airlines like ValueJet, you remember ValueJet, the Everglades, Florida? Google that. We had JetBlue, Frontier Airlines, and Virgin America. Those smaller airlines were able to charge much less than the major airlines, and the airlines were having difficulty competing because of the size of the airlines. They were offering things that the larger airlines couldn't compete with, charging for baggage, food, and just being a no-frill airlines. No pillows, no blankets, no playing cards. The legacy airlines did try to compete by creating their own little airlines within the airlines to compete head-on with these no-frill airlines. It was United had Shuttle by United, Delta had Songs, and I forgot what American had. Maybe American never did have a no-frills within their airlines. I gotta look that up. But the airlines made it through the 90s. It probably was the last bit of glamour and exciting about flying. As the 2000s started, the airlines started losing money again. Gas prices started going up. We were still in a war with the Middle East. The airlines were getting too big, competing with each other. But the nail that sealed the coffin was September 11th, 2001. We all know what happened that day. The airline aviation would change forever as we know it, and the profession of the flight attendant changed overnight. Every bit of glamour that was left of being a flight attendant, it had just went out the window. It started more bankruptcy, more merging. Unions were offering pay cuts to employees, and the profession wasn't really a job for a career. Most airlines started laying off again. It just was a hot mess. The profession became more of a security issue than a safety issue and a glamour issue. It was another add-on to our profession, because you all know we're psychiatrists, doctors, we're lawyers. We have so many job titles as flight attendants. By then, flight attendants were working more flights, working harder, making less money, less work rules. Even our crew meals were gone. By the end of 2000, airlines have become more efficient. They are nickel and diming people. They're charging for everything and anything. I never thought it'd be the day that flight attendants would be charging for food on the aircraft. I just thought, wow, now we're a bus depot. Today, there are less airlines and less aircraft, but the flight attendant profession is still going on. There's a few of us, more work, but the core is strong, and I'm still a flight attendant, and I still love what I do. As the early 2020 started, the airlines were doing amazing. They had bounced back, they were profitable airlines, they had money and cash in the bank, they started buying more routing. My airline was flying all over the world. We were picking up long haul trips because we had just bought some of these 787 planes that can go long range. Some flights were up in the 17, 18-hour flight time, flying to Tel Aviv, flying to India. It was just happy times in 2020. Until late February, early March 2020 came along and things were changing again in the airline industry. There was word that there was a virus going around that were killing people, and it was hitting the United States. By the time April came along, it was clear and present that we had a pandemic on our hands, and it affected the airlines and the flight attendant profession. Flying came to a screeching halt. Halt. I mean, immediately all airlines grounded all their aircrafts. They had to lay off all their people. They had to get protected by the government. It just was a complete mess. Probably the worst time in aviation history. And once again, the flight attendant profession is going to change forever. So that brings till today. Most airlines are on life support right now and being saved by the government and still have a long ways to go. Today I'm still a flight attendant. I work part-time right now. My hours have been reduced, which I'm very thankful for. Will the airlines survive? Will the flight attendant profession survive? Stay tuned for part 2 of this series. You guys had enough of me right now. So I'm gonna end the video right here. And if you wanna hear about part 2, leave a comment down below. And if you like this video and you like this type of series, definitely leave a comment to let me know that you want more of this. Thank you so much for taking this time and going through history of becoming a flight attendant, steward, stewardess, cabin, or whatever. I gotta go, guys. Thanks for watching. Bye, girl, bye. Cut!